I'm Ellen Bernhardt. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Delaware, and I'm so pleased to see all of you on my screen, members of the Jewish community, my colleagues in the Governor's Council of the Faith-Based Partners, and members of the community at large, which is just wonderful. We are very fortunate today to have not only Reverend John Moore with us, but members of the original Freedom Riders from the 1960s. And I don't want to steal your thunder, but we'll be hearing from you shortly. It is our intent to try to confront some of the difficult conversations in today's world. And one of those difficult conversations is about racism. I speak on behalf of the Jewish community when I say that in a week and a half, we will celebrate the festival of Passover. And during the festival of Passover, we read from the Haggadah, we read from the verses, everyone reads them, and the most important verse in the entire Passover Seder is as follows. In every generation, you must recall as if you had been a slave in Egypt and had been freed. We're not reading a story. We're not recalling history. We actually have to do the things that will make us feel as if we were slaves and now we are free. So that we are very, very sensitive to the fact that in Jewish history, we endured slavery and we were freed from slavery. So we, of all people, need to be most conscious of the fact that others still live in slavery and others still are not free, and there's discrimination in the world. And therefore, it's so important for us to confront these difficult conversations that even today, not all people are free. So it is our pleasure and our privilege to have distinguished members of the community speak to us today. Reverend John Moore, Mr. Person, Mr. Hardy. I'm going to turn the program now over to Jen Steinberg, who is the chair of the JCRC, to introduce Reverend Moore. And following his presentation and the presentation of Mr. Hardy and Mr. Person, then she will conduct questions and answers. So put those in the chat for her to follow up. So Jen, please take it over.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome again. Thank you so much for coming today to our JCRC program on confronting racism. I am so pleased to have today with us Reverend Dr. John G. Moore, a native of Philadelphia. In 2005, he retired from the U.S. Air Force after 20 years of honorable service to this nation. He currently serves as Director of Philanthropy and Engagement for the United Way of Delaware. Dr. Moore is the Associate Pastor for the Dover Christian Church in Dover, and he is President and CEO of Total Increase Ministries. On August 26, 2011, he was selected to recite I Have a Dream at a private dedication in Washington, D.C. for the opening of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial that was attended by over 7,500 guests. In 2015, he was awarded the Jefferson Foundation Award by Governor Jack Markell. And in 2016, Dr. Moore was named as the keynote speaker for the New York State Annual Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration by Governor Andrew Cuomo in Albany. Also in 2016, Dr. Moore received the Liberty Bell Award from the Delaware State Bar Association. In 2017, Dr. Moore was selected as the recipient of prestigious Stanford L. Bratton Award by the First State Community Action Agency. And in 2020, Dr. Moore was awarded the Eastern Region Citation Award by the National Sorority of Phi Delta Kappa, Inc. Dr. Moore resides in Magnolia, Delaware with his wife of 35 years, Candace Alfonso Moore. They have two sons, John Jr. and Colin Joshua. His motto in life is, if I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living will not be in vain. And he's also brought with him today special guests, Charles Person and Hank Thomas. So welcome, everyone, and looking forward to the conversation today.
All right. Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction, and good afternoon to all the members of the Jewish Community Relations Committee, my friend, Rabbi Ellen Bernhardt, and to the Jewish Federation of Delaware. And to everybody that's registered here, I acknowledge you today. I do want to state quickly about a great organization that I wear a shirt for today, racialbias.org. And I had some things written down here, but I tell you what, we have the president and founder of racialbias.org and Leland Hardy. And Leland, if you'd like to share some words about what racialbias.org does, that would be great.
Well, I appreciate it. First of all, thank you for having me. And I did in the nick of time get the camera to work, as you can see. So it's my honor to be here, first of all. I've known John Moore since, I don't want to go too far back, but since we were in high school together, Central High School of Philadelphia. So I've known John Moore since probably 1980, I believe, since he was a year behind me. Or no, before that, 1977. Anyway, and we also went to undergraduate school together at Indiana PA. So as we find ourselves in the turmoil of, I will call it the reckoning of America around the issue of racism, perhaps a new reckoning, I found it incumbent upon myself to try to contribute in the way that I was able. And that was in forming an organization called racialbias.org. And the URL is just at racialbias.org. And what we try to do is to raise awareness about the issue and to provide solutions. One of the things we've done is to train police departments around the country in the issue of racial and implicit bias with some unique training that we've developed. We recently come from the city of New Orleans Police Department, training their top commanders. We also went into what I call the belly of the beast, the formerly most racist police department in the country in Gretna, Louisiana. And now we're in talks to provide the same kind of services to member police departments, Louisville, Kentucky, Atlanta, and others, but also large corporate organizations. You might recall Starbucks closed down its offices and operations for a while and trained all of its employees. We're looking to do those same kinds of things at large organizations that have said that they need to have mandatory racial implicit bias training for their people. So that's what we do. And we're, part of it is getting the word out, marketing. Fortunate to be acquainted with Messrs. Person and Thomas, and able to have them consider joining today. And they fortunately accepted the invitation. And John Moore is one of our key persons, is a spokesperson, what I call a subject matter expert on the issue of racial bias. So it's an honor to be here on this webinar.
Thank you, Leland. We really appreciate that. So as we move forward in this webinar, I got to say something. It's very, very serious. And I must admit that I'm proud of it. And I'm an unapologetic, very, very highly proud Black man who has been impacted by systemic racism, especially when I was a young person growing up in the inner city of Philadelphia. It was there that I saw crystal clear the challenges that we dealt with because of the debilitating disease of poverty. And it was also there that I saw the insurmountable challenges when I was young in elementary school of the inequities of education. And yes, often there were times, my friends, as you join me today, that I felt less than a citizen of this country and was told at one time that, I was created equal, just like all men, by God who created man in his image, that I would be endowed by certain unalienable rights, which among these were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, when I looked around at my conditions in North Philadelphia, I was growing up and I saw people like me who had the same nihilistic spirit, that at times it demoted us to a sense of nobodiness. And it caused us to experience issues of fear, issues of deception, and of, at times, unbelievably, self-hate. And yes, I have been profiled. Oh, yes. I've been profiled in the sense of being a criminal. I've been stereotyped as a drug dealer and a gangbanger. And I've even been perceived as a potential thief and a danger to society when I'm crossing paths along my white brothers and sisters who think that because of some stereotype that's been given to me because of the color of my skin, that they'd rather walk across the street and feel safer when I have a doctorate degree. And so all of these things I've faced, and all of this is because of this issue of this ongoing saga called racism. And as I look at racism and I define it, it's a prejudice, a discrimination, antagonism directed against any person or people based on the membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is in a minority or marginalized. And you see, as much as I can make this startling admission that I'm a proud Black man, there are those of you that are on this phone that cannot deny who you are as well. Yes, we have people that may be on this call that are, of course, that are Jewish, Hispanic, Muslim, Native American, white, and other. And sadly to say that no matter which category you fit in, all of us in one way or another have been victimized by this unbelievable subject of racism. And it's not an easy subject to talk about. It's not easy to talk about because of the wicked past that has been exploited and the murders of people physically, emotionally, and spiritually. It is one of those subjects that has, through history, due to a large extent, been swept under the suffocating covers of guilt and denial. Yet we must have the necessary dialogue to help each member of society to rise above the hatred. This is serious. To rise above the discrimination and above the bigotry that we see today in this saga that continues of racism in our society. And let me tell somebody that's listening in our audience today, there are many people who want to deny that racism is an issue. You know, they look back at America's marginalized and they see how far we've come. You know, they tell us things like, you know, you've had an African-American as president of the United States. Many of you who didn't go to college before, now in college, are having these great opportunities to be a part of businesses and so forth. And yet what they fail to see is that people are still impacted by this evil disease called racism. People are told that the subject is offensive and it's painful to talk about, but we must talk about it. It's the only way that we'll be able to cure such a challenge. It is unnerving, and the subject is full of agony, frustration, bewilderment, and indeed impatience. But there are vital steps that we must take to eradicate this disease. We must have the courageous conversations like we're having today, sponsored by the Jewish Federation of Delaware, to be able to talk about racism from all perspectives, that everybody can have their voice heard and that everybody can be accountable. You know, I think about the words of Dr. Martin Luther King when he started talking about injustice and how people didn't want to face it. He put it this way. He said, like a boil that can never be cured as long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all of its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice and racism must likewise be exposed with all of the tension its exposing creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. You see, in light of tragic moments that are the result of the roots of racism, I'm sure each of us on this call today ask ourselves, how many more people are going to have to suffer? Some of us ask ourselves, how many more people are going to have to die? You know, I think about this and I ask myself the question about modern day lynchings like that of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery and Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin. I think about those poor 9 worshipers at Mother Bethel, at Emmanuel AME in Charleston, South Carolina. How many more lives have to be lost? Well, I even think about people like Joyce Feinberg, Richard Godfrey, Rose Mallinger, and Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil and David Rosenthal, Bernice and Sylvan Simon, and David Stein, and Melvin Wax, and the others who lost their lives at the most deadly attack of a Jewish community in the United States at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And we keep asking ourselves, what's it going to take? What's it going to take for people to wake up, to realize that we're all the same? How we look different. We believe in different things, but we're all human beings. And from the enslavement of the Hebrews by the Egyptians to the enslavement of Africans by Americans, the history has been long and a decisive divider of humanity. And there are so many examples of racism in our history. But on this call today, I'm very fortunate that we can pinpoint a specific time frame where racism really raised its heads in the year of 1961 with the Freedom Rise. And we're honored today to have two of the original 13 Freedom Riders, in Mr. Charles Person and Mr. Hank Thomas. And I would love for them to be able to share their experience that adds to this dialogue about racism. So, Mr. Person, if you could start. Oh, you're on mute.
Good afternoon, everyone. I grew up in a community in Atlanta, Georgia, called Buttermilk Bottom. My birth home was about 3 blocks from Dr. King's birth home. In our community, we were, I guess, the undesirables. And in the South at that time, if you were not a white Protestant Anglo-Saxon, you had a problem. They hated all other groups equally. So what happened in our community, those of us worked together. We had merchants from every ethnic group, every religious group in our neighborhood, and we worked collaboratively together. We set the tone for, I guess, for my life. My first job was at a bowling alley in Virginia Highlands. And in Virginia Highlands, there was a community, a Jewish community, and how they protected themselves. They had the streets name changed to Christian names, so people would not knowingly know that it was a Jewish enclave. But the people there were very warm and friendly. And as a young kid now, I'm talking 12, 13 years of age, it's making an impression upon me. As I got older and I entered college and became involved in the student movement, we chose bail, jail, no bail. Well, in the Black community, most Black men worked at jobs that paid $40 to $55 a week. So that wasn't a tremendous amount of money. So when we went to jail in Atlanta, the Jewish community came to our aid. They provided not only financial support to get the students out of jail, but also they provided a lot of the faith and courage to continue, because a lot of people, these were new ideals to us. We were afraid. We didn't know how to demonstrate, but we were going to be nonviolent. After we were successful in Atlanta, the Congress for Racial Equality realized that there were students throughout the South who were trained in nonviolence. And so they issued a request for people to participate. And I submitted my application, not expecting to be chosen. But at 18, especially, we had people with much more experience than I. But the thing is, a core wanted people who were basically squeaky clean, people who had no negatives in their background. So I was fortunate to join that original 13, and it was a unique group of people. We were young and old, Black and white, male and female. And somehow it was a group that bonded very instantly after 3 days of extensive training in Washington, D.C. We were prepared to take on the world. And we had our good days and our bad days. And as we traveled further and further south, things got very, very, very more difficult. For me, I guess the hardest part was when we left Atlanta on Mother's Day and we got into Anderson, Alabama, and we found out that the Greyhound bus had been set afire and our bus driver was not going to continue unless the Blacks got to the back of the bus. Well, the students, we refused to do so, and they began to beat us and throw us back towards the back of the bus. The oldest Freedom Rider, Dr. Bergman, when they knocked him down, they began to stomp him in his chest, and his wife begged him not to kill him. because they probably would that day. James Peck was a bleeder, and when they knocked him to the floor of the bus, his blood covered the floor, which made it slippery. So the scene you had was they were pushing the students back. We were stumbling over Dr. Bergman. We were slipping on James's blood. And eventually it got to the point where they physically threw us to the back of the bus. Once they were satisfied that, that the bus was resegregated, they taunted us all the way into Birmingham. And when we got to Birmingham, James Peck and I were the designated testers. And he was badly beaten and he was bleeding, but he wanted to continue. So I says, well, let's go. And as we went into the terminal, an entire wall of men came towards us. James went down almost immediately. And I guess being younger, I was able to maintain my balance. And I was beaten until a photograph was taken. And when the photograph was taken, they just simply let me go. They attacked the photographer. They destroyed all of his equipment, and they thought they had destroyed all the film packs. But one image did survive Birmingham, and that's one of me being beaten. But the Freedom Rides, we could not continue, and even though we had wanted to continue. But, we found out later that the kids in Nashville were going to continue the Freedom Rides. And I think Hank can fill in all the other points. I didn't want to steal his thunder. But the Freedom Rides was, for me, I got a chance to meet a lot of wonderful people. And to this day, I carry with me that no matter how difficult things are, there are a lot of good people in this world. And we must remember that, because sometimes things are bleak and very desolate. But we must realize that we have allies, and there are people that share us in our desire for freedom. And we must work together. We must teach our kids, and we must rely on each other. At this point, I'll let Hank take over.
Thank you very much, Charles. My main purpose for being here is to say thank you. Thank you to members of the Jewish community. The first time I ever walked a picket line protesting racism outside of Washington, D.C., 80 to 90% of those people walking that picket line were Jews. I didn't realize that until afterwards. Also on that picket line, picketing the racism of the Glen Echo Amusement Park, were two Auschwitz survivors. I knew very little about the Holocaust at that particular moment. They showed me their tattoos. Afterwards, I asked one of them, because I was so amazed. Here it was, just 19 years after they had been rescued from the death camp. Here they were in this country, walking a picket line protesting racism against me, against my people. So I asked them simply why. They said when the Germans were rounding up Jews in Eastern Europe and in Germany, nobody stood up to protest. And of course, they vowed that never again would they stand by and see injustice and do nothing. At Howard University, when we started our movement with SNCC, we went first, I think, over into Hyattsville, Maryland that weekend after the students set in Greensboro. The next weekend, or the next week, students, Jewish students from American University came over to Howard to ask to join us. And of course they did. And each weekend, alternating, we would go either into Maryland or to Virginia. And then I think sometime a few months after that, the Jewish students invited us over into American University, which at that time was segregated. And of course, that really upset the administration there at American University. But these were my first memorable encounters with Jews. For the past 55 years, I've been speaking all over the country, whether at synagogues, civic organizations, where there have been Jews, and I simply have said, thank you. Thank you very much for the help you gave us. People don't know the Freedom Riders, 50% of them were white. And of the white Freedom Riders, 60 to 65% of them were Jews. When I speak to young African Americans who know very little, unfortunately, about the Civil Rights Movement and certainly about the Freedom Riders, I tell them that in the summer of 1964, when the 3 civil rights workers were murdered, James Chaney, the Black, and the 2 with him, Jews. Those Jews were murdered along with Chaney. Throughout our movement, Jews often suffered much more than some of the Blacks did. During the summer of '64, in what was called Freedom Summer, a lot of the white students from the North were Jewish students who came down. I tell this to the Jews, of course, they understand that, but I say thank you. Thank you very much. And part of that has been my disgust, if you will, with some of the anti-Semitic utterance that have come from some of the people from my community, people who did not participate in the Civil Rights Movement, the Muslim, and other folks. And I say, do you understand, do you know what the Jewish community has meant to us Blacks, not just in the direct action of the Civil Rights Movement, but in terms of our educational units, whether at Spelman, at Morehouse, at Howard, there isn't a Black institution of higher learning that has not benefited from Jewish philanthropy. Do you know that? And of course, they don't know. I made it a point in my library today, pretty close to 1/3 of all of the books in my library are about Jews and Jewish heritage. I wanted to find out as much as I can about these folks who risk so much to help us. And I'm glad the young lady opened saying, talking about Jews and slavery in Egypt. Yes, you were slaves in Egypt, and you helped us out of slavery in this country. In conclusion, I say to you, thank you, thank you. Next year in Jerusalem.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thomas. And I think that this was just the perfect marriage for having you to be a part of this, yourself and Mr. Person and Leland, because it's all about us working together. You know, Maya Angelou used to often quote Publius Terentius Afer, who's a Roman African playwright. And she went to her grave stating this: Hamosum humani nahil ame alienum puto. And when you translate that statement, it means, I am a human being, and I consider nothing that is human alien to me. And then when I think of a parallel statement, I think of Dr. King, who once said, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. You know, he went on to say, for some strange reason, I could never be what I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. The rich man could never be what he ought to be until the poor man is what he ought to be. And then he quoted the poet John Donne. He said, John Donne quoted and placed it in graphic terms that no man is an island, entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And then he went on to say that every man's death diminishes me, for I'm involved with mankind. Therefore, never sin for whom the bell tolls.
It tolls for thee.
It tolls for thee. And yes, and that's where my pursuit is. You know, I grew up in systemic racism. I see it all the time. Being a person of color, I've been confronted with it, the evils and the misconceptions. And I tell you what, my goal is to stand up as strongly as Mr. Person and as Mr. Thomas and all those who walked beside you and say that we're not going to take it any longer. We have to do this as an entire community. It can't just be one section of the community. You know, we're all people. No one's greater than anyone else. No one's lesser. We all share common emotions. And in the end, we're all creatures of one divine creator. I put it this way, we're all fathers and mothers, daughters and sons and friends. We all live. We all die. We all laugh. We all cry. And we shall have within our power the power to overcome darkness with light, sorrow with joy, chaos with peace, and hate with love. That's why in so many places that I've gone out to speak this year, I've had as a theme in representing Dr. Martin Luther King, the advancement of the beloved community. He talked about this community until the day that his life was taken. And with the beloved community, it's about a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of Mother Earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because of international standards of human decency, and they will not be allowed. Things like racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced with an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. And fundamental to this concept of the beloved community is that inclusiveness, both economic and social. The notion that all can share in the earth's bounty. And describes it as a society in which the social product is shared far more equally than we see it shared today. And I believe that this can happen. I believe that all of God's children can learn to work together, pray together, struggle together, just like they did in the 60s, go to jail together and stand up for freedom together. The beloved community also describes a society in which all of God's children, as Dr. King once put it, and that all men are made in his image, and that figuratively speaking, every man from a bass black to a treble white is significant on God's keyboard. And that means that Black men, white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, Episcopalians, Muslims, Hindus, Latter-day Saints, the Baha'i, the Unitarian Universalist, and all other faiths, none will be discriminated against. Rabbi Ellen, that's why I love serving in a Delaware Coalition of Faith-Based Partnerships. I get to see all the different faiths, and I get to hear their love and their passion for what they believe. But at the end of the day, as we share our holidays and as we share our commonalities, we come to find out that your love more than anything else is universal. Because we know that it is love, that foundational principle, will be the true answer to reconciliation. It will be the end of redemption, the end of the creation, of transforming and having the power to transform enemies into friends. It is this type of understanding and creative goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of all men. And we can do this. We just need to continue to have these conversations that we're able to address these things from all perspectives, be able to look at ourselves in the mirror and admit when we're right and also admit when we're wrong. Now, I've said this in talking about this beloved community. I think of two sermons that Dr. King gave. I shared this with Beth Shalom Synagogue in both Wilmington and in Dover. I shared this also with other organizations that I've gone to. And those two sermons were rediscovering lost values and loving your enemies. And in rediscovering lost values, Dr. King put a strong emphasis on two principles: that all reality hinges on moral foundation, which means that this world is driven by godly order. And second is that all reality has spiritual control, that there is a God in the process. And when we have this type of reverence for God and his creation, then there's no way we can look at his creation with hatred, discrimination, bigotry, and have senses of just wanting to put people down. We're all people. And then it comes to his sermon about loving your enemies. I remember talking with Rabbi Michael Bill shortly after what took place in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life. And there were a gamut of emotions that he was dealing with. There were a gamut of emotions that I was dealing with as we saw innocent people who were just doing an act of worship lose their lives to hatred. And you hear people say, well, in the midst of such a disastrous situation, what do? And we say, as believers, we pray. We pray for God's peace. We pray for God's deliverance. We pray for God's forgiveness and reconciliation. And so Dr. King talked about it from this perspective: the theoretical, the practical how you love an enemy, and the theoretical why. And when you talk about how we love our enemy, it starts with looking at ourselves. Could we be the source? Could we actually be the source of what's causing the friction? That animosity and that feeling that someone may have, we need to ask ourselves, did we do something wrong first? Let me be accountable. And then the second thing is, how you love your enemy is you find the good in all people. Like I mentioned earlier, we're all human, right? We all express the same emotions: joy and happiness, laughter and pain, even hatred. We all do. It's within us. But the reality is, in the worst of people, as we may classify them, in the worst of people, they're good. And in the best of people, there's hatred. And it's about how you balance that and make sure that it is the right emotion that comes forward. And we don't have a place to hate anyone because we're all God's creation. So find the good in every person. I know it's difficult, especially when tragedy happens and we see things like what happened with George Floyd, and you look at that gentleman with his knee on his neck and you try to find a good that can cause forgiveness. Not the lack of accountability, but forgiveness. And then the third how you love your enemy is when you have the opportunity to defeat them. This is, I think, Mr. Person and Mr. Thomas can stand on this. That's not the time to do it. I'm sure as they were riding those freedom rides and they were being attacked, the one thing that could have been in the back of their mind was to retaliate with violence and anger. But they chose nonviolence. And as it said, it's hard for a man to attack someone that doesn't attack them back. And so why should we love our enemy? And here's the theoretical why. One is hate for hate only perpetuates more hate. If we're in society, and I spent 20 years in the United States Air Force, and we're out there constantly attacking an enemy, and the enemy is attacking us back, and we keep going back and forth, that warfare will never stop. Sooner or later, someone must have sense enough to turn on the light of love and to turn on the light of redemption. And the second thing is why we need to love our enemy is this. People think that it's the hater. It's the hated. I'm sorry, it's the hated that's really the real victim when it comes down to racism and discrimination. But the reality is the hater deals with just as much imbalance as the person being hated. It causes you to not think right, not be rational, not make good sense, not be as intelligent in your thought process as you should be. And so we got to realize that hatred and racism is just as injurious to the person who leads the way with it than it is to the person who's targeted. And my final point is this. We must love our enemy because there is redemptive power in love. I know that's difficult, but I've seen it with my own eyes, even through history. I use this great example of Governor George Wallace from Alabama, one of the most staunch segregationists ever, who stood on the steps of the University of Alabama denying admission of African-American students, who chanted his beloved statement of segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, who found himself 30 years from the day of Bloody Sunday in 1995 at a church with over 200 Black parishioners, holding hands with him, singing "We Shall Overcome" and asking for forgiveness. And instead of taking the bitterness of his segregation and hatred to his grave, he took instead the actions of forgiveness and love. How are we going to get rid of this racism? We must continue to talk. We must continue to work together. We must be willing to make those necessary changes in order to be able to open our ears and our hearts to all of mankind. Never again to look at people by the color of their skin, but as Dr. King said, judge them by the content of their character. And so I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you. I know we have a question and answer period. This has always been a very difficult and challenging time. Many businesses are now putting such a great focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think it was absolutely courageous for you to have this conversation today. And I want to thank Leland, Mr. Person, and Mr. Thomas for being here to share so transparently the things that they experienced. And if we're to make a better tomorrow, let us continue to stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and love one another because we're all children of one Creator. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Moore. So we do have some questions, both that have been submitted in the chat as well as come in other ways. So if I may, would like to ask, I have a question actually for Mr. Person and Mr. Thomas, since they spoke so lovely about their experience as freedom riders and interacting with the Jewish community back in the 60s. I'm wondering if they might speak to how they feel the state of Black-Jewish relations are in this country today and what they think can be done to make sure that these stories continue to be known, even as the people who were direct witnesses to it are no longer with us.
Well, I'll go first. I think there is a recurrence, an overt occurrence to anti-Semitism in this country. Now, I speak to at least a dozen Jewish schools throughout the year, and they're very inquisitive about, our past, but also how we can make things better. And I tell them that change begins with one individual, that we all can make a difference. And fortunately, all change mostly begins with young people. So they're the best group to deal with for working on these types of issues. And the point I emphasize more than any is that you can talk about race without animosity and without bitterness. I mean, you will get upset and everything will make you angry, but we can channel that into solutions. And I think that one of the things that's always encouraging is the young kids are optimistic enough to think that they can make a difference in the world and that there are those of us who are there to help them. And that's what we try to do.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas, anything you'd like to add?
Now,
Okay.
you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm concerned about what's going on now. Germany in the 30s, when the Nazis came to power and brought out the worst of the German people. See, I don't blame everything on the Nazis per se. It was the Germans. The anti-Semitism has been a part of the German culture for a long time. Racism has been a part of our culture for a long time. Then along came a politician in Germany who saw a path to power by making Jews the scapegoat. Republicans and Donald Trump has made black folks and people of color the scapegoats. And with all of these new rules concerning trying to suppress the black vote, but Donald Trump and his group unleash the hidden or the latent racism in this country. And this is what concerns me. Every time there's been an election lately, and certainly with the election of President Obama, tremendous sales of guns. These are the things that concern me. Then the attacks on Mother Bethel Church and the attack on the synagogue. Unfortunately, I don't think we've seen the last of that unless Congress, government does something about it. But the other scary thing to me is of the people who attacked the Capitol, a sizable number of them were ex-service people. A sizable number of them were police officers. These are the things that scare me the most.
Thank you. Have a follow-up question to this, either for Reverend Moore or for Mr. Hardy. What do you feel is currently missing from the dialogue about racism in America today? A member of our committee asked specifically about Professor Kendi's statements about well, you can either be a racist or an anti-racist. Is there room for dialogue in this, or are there things that we can add to this anti-racist racism conversation in the country?
I did take note of that. This is Leland Hardy. I did take note of the comment in the sidebar there. And I think that what is meant by that statement is that one has to be an activist on some level. You cannot sit idly by and think that the scourge of racism is going to go away by itself. It comes largely from a lack of understanding. I too, like John Moore, grew up in the inner city, Philadelphia, in a 100% or nearly 100% Black area, an impoverished area. And but I ended up going to a number of schools where I was clearly one of few Blacks. So I had the opportunity to be exposed to others of different ethnicities, backgrounds, and so on. I had a number of very great, white friends, Jewish friends who I retain as lifelong friends to this day. So I think it all comes down to understanding and standing up whenever we see any kind of injustice, any kind of discrimination, any kind of racism. in whatever way you might. Some people don't have a personality to be up front and stand at the top of the podium, but you can stand behind the podium and support those who are and do have the effrontery to be up front. But everyone has to take a stand. Everyone has to be an activist within and of themselves in order to help eradicate racism.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, Leland, you know, growing up in the inner city, the one blessing, and I told you, I saw very clearly the challenges of an educational system that was unequal. But then I got the opportunity to go to high school with Leland, to a school called Central High School, with the top academic school in Philadelphia. Where I met brilliant people like Leland. Leland speaks like, I don't know how many languages he speaks, and he's a Wharton School. I'm gonna brag about him just real quick. He's a Wharton School graduate. He's a former stockbroker for Bear & Stearns, and he was the Pennsylvania Golden Glove heavyweight champion all in the same time. I wouldn't get in the ring with him, nor would I get on Wall Street with him. The man is matchless. Leland, that's your plug.
Appreciate it.
But what happened is that here was a kid that came out of this systemic racist type of environment where I thought that I would never amount to much more than being a member of a gang like my brothers were, or just growing up in poverty and on welfare. But then being surrounded by academic excellence at Central High School challenged me academically to pursue things that were far higher than anything that I saw in my concrete jungle of North Philadelphia. And I was able to pursue college and be able to get, you know, a number of degrees that allow me to experience the humbling joy that I have today. So I believe that if we go back to our communities now and the work that I do for the United Way of Delaware, I go into these school systems. We have 8 key communities that are based on low socioeconomic situations and poor school performance. And you inspire these kids and you inspire these parents by giving them the information they need for the resources they need to be successful and get their kids their education, then the sky's the limit regardless of where they live at. I have experienced it myself, and I know it's something that we can do today.
Follow-up question to that, if I may. You mentioned your work here in Delaware. Can you speak to a little bit about what do you think are the biggest problems we have in terms of what do you think? It feels small to say what are the biggest problems with racism here in Delaware today. But what do you think are the key drivers?
You know, I think this is unique, especially to live here. I'm from Philadelphia, but I've lived here now for 20 years. And Delaware has 3 distinct counties. Very distinct. I live down in Kent County and often have to travel down to Sussex County. And it's interesting, you know, I've had the opportunity to travel to Alabama and some of the other southern states. And when I go down to Georgetown, Seaford, and I go to Laurel, I almost feel like I'm headed down to, you know, Montgomery or Selma in a sense because of the mentality that's there. And sadly to say that, you know, when you come up to Wilmington and you see that's where all the real success financially is taking place, you sense this great mentality of the lessers to be. So this is unfortunate. In my work that I do with United Way, we have some schools in certain districts where 3rd grade reading proficiency is less than 20%. That's inexcusable. We're talking about children that are entering in the 4th grade who need to be able to read in order to be successful and moving forward. And we're talking about 18% of those children are prepared for that. And so I look at that from a systemic standpoint. We are putting a resource in place. We are doing all we can because we feel that, you know, we're investing in areas where kids are already successful and they're not in the Black communities. And so we are going to run into these problems. And I served as a youth pastor for 18 years down here in Kent County. And let me tell you something. I always used to make this statement. It's kind of awkward for people to understand it, but you always are going to have to eat. And what I mean by that is that if you don't get your eating because of your education and being able to get a job, you're still going to satisfy that need. And what happens is, unfortunately, it leads to criminality, people getting caught up in all these different antisocial behaviors because they need to survive. We need to do more to eliminate such actions by making sure that we got resources where they're firmly needed. And I think that will be part of the elimination of racism in the state of Delaware.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question that I saw in the comments. It was a question about how to counter the statement when, you know, talk about Black Lives Matter, countering the statement with the, well, all lives matter. And I know it'll say, you know, all lives won't matter till Black Lives Matter. Do you think that's enough, or do you think there's more that we can say?
Leland, you wanna attack that?
Any of the four of you, feel free to weigh in.
I'll address that. From a, you know, from the standpoint of a definition, of course, all lives matter. However, there was a movement called Black Lives Matter that was the impetus of significant change, not just here in the United States, but globally. And it was causing awareness that there has been this issue that needed to be confronted, this issue of systemic racism, this issue of you know, the uncomfortability of walking as a Black man not dressed well. For example, if I was to dress casually, and just as John said, he experienced things. You know, I can go into a fine high-end store if I'm dressed in a sweatshirt or something, likely to be looked at differently than if I go in dressed in a three-piece suit. That's just how it goes. However, can we overcome that over time? Yes, has there been a tremendous reckoning and awakening of consciousness by Black Lives Matter? Yes. Do all lives matter? Of course. It just so happens that there was a movement called Black Lives Matter that was the impetus for much of the awakening of the consciousness. So I don't think people should take the name of the movement, Black Lives Matter, to be exclusionary of other lives that matter, since all of them do. I must also say one of the other things we've done, of course, I saw that they posted our URL, our website address on the common area of racialbias.org. One of the other ones we use is endunconsciousbias.org. And we have that pointing to the same place. So we can end unconscious bias. That's what we are trying to affect. And institutions in the military, certainly interested in sitting down with General Lloyd Austin as soon as that can be arranged to discuss with him these issues and some other things. In the military, it's needed. It's needed in the police departments. It's needed for people to have others other than themselves welcome to their home. Or if you don't want to welcome somebody to your home, go join them at Starbucks or somewhere else. Sit down and have a conversation. Invite somebody to have a cup of coffee that you otherwise wouldn't interface with. And that's going to broaden understanding. I would encourage people to do.
Mr. Person?
He's on mute. You on mute.
Oh,
I'm now. You hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I like to read a quotation, Miss Ella Baker, and I think it was, even though it was made in the 60s, it's very appropriate today. And she says, until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons become as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until that happens. So yes, all lives do matter, but the thing is right now the impetus should be on those men and women who are killed unarmed, you know, we had no reason of their own. But we have, it's time for a change. We have to make a difference. And maybe the conversation today is a unique beginning, and hopefully we will take advantage of that.
Okay, any fun, Ellen, do you want to close us out here?
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end, and we could stay on and speak about this important issue for many, many more hours. And I hope that this is just the beginning of a dialogue. I cherish my meetings with the Governor's Council of Faith-Based Partnerships, and You're absolutely right. It is through the interaction, it's through the communication, it's through the friendship of one to one that we can overcome hate and foster understanding. I want to thank you, Reverend Moore, so very much. John, you are an inspiration since I've met you, such an inspiration. And thank you so much for bringing Mr. Hardy and Person and Thomas on today. You just enriched our conversation. I do want to add one small thing. You thanked the Jewish community, and I want to say that we thank you. When the Tree of Life incident happened and we had a service to commemorate that, you were all there. Not only the African American community, but the interfaith community. You came out in droves and supported us, just like we've tried to support you and the Muslim community when it needed us. And we will continue to do that. And the image of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Dr. Martin Luther King comes to mind, that we will continue, we pledge to continue to walk hand in hand with our brothers and sisters as they did not so many years ago. So as we come out of COVID and spring comes, let us all resolve to be kinder and more sensitive and more just human beings. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Reverend Moore.